Example 2. In this example, we're going to add integers with different signs. In other words, we're going to learn how to add both positive and negative numbers together. We'll be using number lines to help assist us, and we'll also be going back and looking at the idea of absolute value again. Kara entered her chili recipe into the neighborhood cook-off. 9 judges rated each recipe with a thumbs up, +1, or a thumbs down, -1. What was the final rating for Kara's recipe? So in the reasoning here, we need to look at the thumbs. There were more thumbs down votes, so the final rating has to be a negative number. So in this case, we're going to do something called looking for 0 pairs. You might have talked about this in 6th grade as well. 0 pairs are 2 numbers that you can put together to make 0. So like we talked about in the previous lesson, a +1 and a -1 are opposites, and opposites make 0. So a +1 plus a -1 equals 0. So when you look at the chili cook-off scorecard, you'll notice that each thumbs down and thumbs up that has a pair with it actually makes a 0. And then you'll notice that there's one extra thumb here pointed down, which tells me that all those others cancel each other out, and the final score would be a -1 because there's one extra thumbs down than thumbs up. So let's look at the number line. The number line, to represent Kara's final rating, starts with 5 units to the left to model the 5 thumbs down. So we start at 0. Oops, let me change my color here. We start at 0 and we move to -5. Then, I'm going to use blue like they did, we're going to move 4 units to the right from that position. So right now we're at -5. Now I need to go 4 units in the positive direction, which means back towards 0. Because remember, all the positive numbers are on the right side of that number line, and all the negative numbers are on the left. So now the question is, where do you end up? Well, this point where you end up is -1. So the sum of -5 and 4 is located 4 units to the right of that -5, which means in the positive direction. Okay, 4 units to the right of -5, and that final position is a -1. So -5 plus 4 equals -1. Now let's look over here on the other side of the page where we've got, dividing that out there, where we've got the idea of using absolute value. So in this case, we have integers that have different directions to them. Positive numbers, remember, go to the right, negative numbers move to the left. So what we're essentially doing is subtracting those absolute values. Okay, so the absolute value of a -5 tells me that it's 5 units from 0, and the absolute value of 4 tells me it's 4 units from 0, but I want the difference between them. So I want this to be a subtraction problem because I need to know how many more thumbs down did she get than thumbs up. And there is one more thumbs down vote than thumbs up vote. So we know that that is a difference of 1. But the question is that going to be a +1 answer or a -1? Well, when we subtracted the absolute values, we get a +1. But we moved a greater distance to the left, okay? So there was more thumbs down than there were thumbs up. So that means the sum also has to be a -1 or a negative number. And one final thought before we move on to example 3 is that the integer with the greater distance to 0 will always decide the sign of the answer. So if the negative number is farther from 0 than the positive number, the answer is negative. If the positive number is farther from 0, then the answer will be positive. So we're always looking for those absolute values, those distances from 0 for each of the numbers, and then we subtract them in order to find out which one there's more of and how much more there is. Now let's take a look at example 3. Example 3 has us looking at identifying additive inverses and opposite integers. So we're going to go back to the idea here of opposites, which we just mentioned a minute ago are also called zero, if I can write that, zero pairs. In other words, a pair of numbers that together make 0. We also have a fancy name for those. They are called additive inverses. So you need to know that vocabulary because the word additive inverses is used when we really mean opposites. Playing golf, Mike got a +2 on the first hole and a -2 on the second hole. So what is his combined score for the first 2 holes? Well, if he got a +2 and then a -2, then what we're doing is putting together opposites. But when the signs of the addends are different, we subtract their absolute value. When the signs of the addends are different, we subtract the absolute values. Memorize that, okay? So a +2 and a -2 will always go together to make 0, okay? And you can show this again on the number line because you start at 0. The first integer is positive, so you're going to move 2 units in the positive direction. And then you're going to go from that position 2 units in the negative direction, which takes you back and you end up at 0. So now I'd like for you to pause the video and complete the try it questions A, B, and C below example 3. Come back and check your answers when you're finished. All right, now let's take a look at these 3 solutions. In all 3 cases, I showed you how to do this using absolute value. For part A, we have -66 plus 42. So if I take the absolute value of a -66 and the absolute value of 42, and because these 2 numbers have opposite signs, the first number is negative, the second number is positive, then we're going to find those absolute values and subtract them. So how far is -66 from 0? Well, it's 66 units. How far is +42 from 0? It's 42 units. And the difference between them is 24. You'll notice that the answer is -24 though, because the number with the larger absolute value I've circled in red, and that number was negative. So that means that the difference between the 66 and 42, although it's 24, is actually a negative value because there is more of the negative number than there is the positive number. Now look at part B. We have -57 and a +57 that we're putting together by addition. Since those 2 numbers are opposites, you can automatically know that those 2 are just going to produce a sum of 0. Okay, and I put a line through the 0 to make sure you didn't think it was the letter O. But you can also show this using the strategy for adding integers with different signs, specifically from example 3. So the absolute value of a -57 is 57, and the absolute value of a +57 is also 57. And when you subtract 57, take away 57, you get 0. And lastly, we have C, 29 plus a -28. This answer is a positive one. And again, just like in part A, I showed you how to do this with absolute value, and I circled the number that had the greater absolute value. In this case, +29 had a bigger absolute value than a -28. So because the positive number has a greater absolute value, then that means the answer is going to also be positive after you find that difference. So the difference between 29 and 28 is 1, and that is going to remain a positive 1 answer because, again, the 29 had a larger absolute value and it is a positive integer. Now let's go on to try some things on your own. First, make a note of the key concept. When adding integers with the same sign, you find the sum, and then the sign is the same on your answer as it was on the two numbers you added together. So negative 36 plus negative 12 is like putting together 36 and 12 to get 48, but since both of them are negative and you're moving in the negative direction, the answer finally is a negative 48. When adding integers with different signs, you have to find the difference. And the difference is the difference of their absolute values. So positive 18 plus negative 14 means find the difference between 18 and 14, and the answer is 4. And then you have to check to see which integer had the larger absolute value. In this case, 18 did, and it was positive, so that means your answer will remain positive. Now I'd like for you to try questions 2 and 4 through 6 here on page 22. Pause the video while you try them and then come back and check your answers. Go ahead and check your answer to number 2 and see if that makes sense. If it doesn't, you need to come see me for further explanation. Now check your answer to number 4. Remember, because one integer is positive and the other is negative, you have to find the difference and use the sign on your answer of the integer with the greater absolute value. In looking at number 5, don't forget that because both integers are negative, they're moving in the same direction. So when you have the same sign, you go ahead and add those integers together, and then the sign on the answer is the same as the sign on the two addends. In this case, it would end up being a negative 85 feet because you moved twice in the negative direction. And last on this page, we have number 6. Yes, that expression does represent the situation. When the temperature dropped 23 degrees, that would be represented with a negative 23. And adding the temperature plus the drop in temperature will determine the new nighttime temperature. And last, I want you to try questions 7 through 16. Yes, that's all of them. All right. There are only 16 questions in this lesson. We're going to try all of them before we have to move on to actually practicing addition, where there's not a lot of context around those questions. We need to be fluent in adding both positive and negative integers together. So you're going to pause the video while you do that, and then come back and check your answers. And I'll display them one at a time. Okay. As you go, you can come back and check each answer. And it'll be about 5 seconds on each answer before you need to pause it for the next question. You've now completed lesson 1-3, Add Integers.